First of all, I'd like to thank everybody here for the wonderful, warm welcome you've given me, and also my wife, Jill, who's sitting here somewhere. I'm not going to really talk about food very much this morning. I'm going to talk about kitchens and servants in dining rooms and kitchens. So I want to look at two very large houses in England which are very similar in size to Kačina, and to tell you about the domestic arrangements there, which are really quite extraordinary. Kitchens were really dangerous places. They were sources of fires, and many great palaces and houses burnt down because of places like this. This is a medieval kitchen from the 15th century in England, in Gainsborough Hall, and about 12 years ago I made a movie in this kitchen, which this still is from, and you can see the fireplace with all of the flames. So from the very early period, when kitchens were designed and built, the fire risk was so obvious that they started building kitchens which were away from the main building and often made out of stone. This is a wonderful 14th century one which is still there in England. You can visit it at Glastonbury. And here's another, same kind of period, which is still there in Durham. It's the cathedral kitchen, originally for the abbot of the monastery there. And it was designed to be made completely out of stone, so if there was ever a fire, it wouldn't cause a great deal of damage. And this is a very unusual, rare drawing of it in 1900, when it was still being used as a kitchen. And you can see, for instance, these are the stewing stoves, which were used for cooking fine foods. And then over here, meat was roasted in front of the fire. But you've got this wonderful stone structure, and this is one kitchen that never burnt down because of this. This is a kitchen very close to where I live in northern England, and again, it's what we call a pavilion kitchen. It's separate from the house, so the fire can't move from the kitchen into the main dwelling. It's a good arrangement. It was very successful. But it often meant that the servants had to move the food from the kitchen to the dining area, and it was often a long distance. This is a Scottish house, a beautiful Palladian house from the 18th century. And you can see very clearly here that the kitchen is in here. That is the kitchen. And the food was moved from the kitchen area along this corridor and then up to the piano nobile where the dining room was. So this is the kitchen. It's a kitchen I've worked in, and you can see the same kind of arrangement as the one at Durham Cathedral, where you have these stewing stoves. Again, look, source of fire. Over here, there is a big fireplace again, and there is also a pastry oven. But everything is built of stone to protect it. So the servants had to take the food to the main dining room, which is a very beautiful Robert Adams Scottish interior. And of course, this is the thing they were trying to protect from the fire, the beautiful ornamentation in the room, the paintings, the furniture, the porcelain and the silver. So it was basically to protect their very valuable goods that they built these separate kitchens. Now, Milan was in England a while ago, and I know he visited this house, which is called Petworth. It's in southern England, and this clearly shows that the kitchen is a completely separate building, completely separate. And to get to the house, which is over here, there is a tunnel, which you could take the food up to the dining room. So let's look at some very large properties in England. This is one of the largest houses in Britain. It's called Wentworth Wood House. This part of it was built in the middle of the 18th century for a man who became prime minister. He wanted to show off his position and his wealth with this house, which is incredibly large. This photograph dates from the First World War, and you can see that this end, sorry, let me go back. Can you see the smoke coming out of the chimneys? That's the kitchen area. And the dining room, the state dining room, is in here. And the food had to be taken in an underground tunnel all the way here and then up the stairs by the servants. A week ago, I visited this house and I walked the distance. It was 110 meters down a corridor. But to make this easier, they put in a railway line underground in a tunnel, which went from here underground all the way like this, and then a lift that went up. In the 19th century that happened. And these railway lines were not common, but there were 3 or 4 British houses that had them in. They were made by a French company called Decovie, who made railways for quarries. This is the dining room at that house. It's a magnificent room, but it's a long, 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 long way from the kitchen. But what I want to examine first as a case study is this house, which reminds me of this particular property. It's very similar. It's about the same size, and it's also about the same date as here, as Kačina. It was finished around about 1820, so it's 200 years old. But it was not built as a house for a family. It was built to house an art collection by an archbishop, a Protestant archbishop, who was the Marquis of Bristol. He was Harvey, he came from the Harvey family. And he lived mainly in Italy, and he collected antiquities and Renaissance sculpture, and he wanted to put that in this house. But unfortunately, he was in Siena. He had a warehouse full of all of his collection, which was going to come to England, and Napoleon invaded the Italian peninsula, and he confiscated, well, his troops confiscated the Archbishop's art collection. The Archbishop died in Italy. He was homeless, and he died in a ditch, apparently. So this building, which he had started, had only reached the foundation level, but one of his descendants married a rich woman and finished it. So this was completed in the 1820s. It's a huge house. This is a photograph taken of the Harveys in 1911. You can see the Marchesa, this lady here, in her coronation robes. It was a year of a coronation, and that is the Marquis. And they're entertaining the local children on the lawn. And it's notable for its wonderful dining room, which has got one of the best collections of Huguenot silver. This is all 18th century silver. It's really well worth a visit if you're in England. And there is a photograph of the front of the house. And so what I've done is I've marked it with some numbers. So for instance, everyday meals were served to the family in the east wing, and the kitchen is very, very close. But sometimes in the hunting season, they had their meals in a much larger, grand state dining room, and the food had to travel underground all the way to here, and then the poor servants had to go up the stairs to deliver the food, and then when the meal was finished, they'd come down the stairs and they'd go back along the corridor with the washing up. So it's very, very difficult for them. So about 15 years ago, I supervised a restoration of a new kitchen that was built in 1911, which was basically underneath the dining room, so that people could have food here taken up in a lift. But what I'd like to do is to show you that long journey. So this is the east wing, where the family lived most of the time, and that is the kitchen area there. The dining room was in here, so they're next to each other. It was very convenient. A bit like here at Kačina, the kitchen was in the basement, and it could come straight up to the dining room. This is a photograph of one of the ranges in that East Wing kitchen. And here in the 1930s is the cook, and you can see behind her that range. And just here is a very interesting thing which dates from an earlier period, which is one of these. Originally, the kitchen had an open fireplace with a clockwork mechanism to roast the meat. And that thing here is this. It's a screen which reflected the heat back into the fire to make the roasting more effective, but you could warm up, keep your food very, very warm. So, for instance, this joint of beef would then travel all the way down, 150-meter corridor to get to the dining room. And there is that object. It's still there from a much earlier period. This is the route that the food took from the kitchen, which is just left of those steps. And it traveled along this underground corridor. All of the pipework is modern. There were 3 sets of steps that the servants had to lift trolleys up. They had a trolley like this. This is an electrical one, actually, but they had ones with charcoal inside. And the trolleys had to be lifted up the steps. So I'm thinking about the servants. It was a really difficult job for them. There was a notice on the wall of the kitchen which said servants must not have rides on the trolley, because some of the younger girls would jump on it and push themselves along the corridors. So this is the cupola, and you can see that the state dining room was up here. So back, oh yes, one of them, they did not want to see servants in this house, so in the main room there were alcoves in the walls. If a servant saw a member of the family coming, they would hide in these, like the alcove up there, they'd hide in it. And they did not want to see the servants. They had to be invisible. So if you had to go from the kitchen, there were different staircases in this sunken outdoor corridor. So interesting arrangement. This is a letter from a man who supervised the building of a new kitchen underneath the main dining room. And this is a kitchen that I was involved in restoring about 15 years ago. And it meant that the food could be prepared and then taken up the stairs, but he built in a lift as well. So that long journey still happened because there was nowhere to wash up, so all the washing up still had to go down the corridor. And the servants protested. They hated it. They absolutely hated it. So, and in that room there are these new, quite modern stoves, which, were the latest thing in 1911. And they're still there, but they don't work. They no longer work. The kitchen has got an interesting collection of copper. This is the Marquis of Bristol, MB 1840, only a short time after this building was built, actually. And this is the kind of food. Halfway down the corridor, there was a storeroom to put cold food, and it had a kind of net to stop the insects getting in, the flies and the wasps. So this is the kind of food. I'm showing this because some of you are going to see some food like this evening. And of course, instead of having to carry the food up the stairs, they had a lift. But they still had to take all the washing up back down to the other kitchen. So it was a terrible time. So this is the state dining room. Some wonderful objects on the table. And this is a recreation of a dessert that I did, not in this house, but one from a very, very similar period with a surtout and some wonderful porcelain. But the house I really want to concentrate on is Welbeck Abbey, which was the seat of the Dukes of Portland, who were a very wealthy English family. And this is an eccentric house because in the 19th century, the 5th Duke of Portland, he loved building, and he also loved building tunnels. So he created an underground ballroom, an underground library, and he converted this stable bit into a kind of servants' quarters. So the kitchens were in here, and the food had to travel underground along this corridor. There's two corridors, there's one overground and another one underneath. And the actual state dining room was over there. So this had an even longer journey than in the other house. Now, the house has got some incredible associations with gastronomy and food, mainly these two ladies. The lady on the left is Henrietta Harley, who was the Countess of Oxford. Both Oxford Street in London and Harley Street are named after her husband. And the woman on the right is her daughter, who was Margaret Cavendish Bentinck, the Duchess of Portland. Both of them wrote cookery books by hand, and I've been working on these manuscripts now for 3 years. They're quite extraordinary. In fact, Milan came to a class I did a few weeks ago, cooking foods from these two books. This is Henrietta Harley, the Countess of Oxford. She was an antiquarian, and she remodeled parts of the house. So she was interested in the neo-Gothic style in the 18th century. So this is a photograph I took of what's called the Gothic Hall. It's a wonderful hall with this perpendicular. But there was a problem because in the early 20th century there was a fire and it was partially damaged. So here she is. She was the richest woman in England, and she loved food, and she had a very, very good table. This is her dessert service, silver gilt dessert service. She was a natural historian. She collected shells, was interested particularly in insects. So all of these silver gilt dishes have like insects on them, this is for serving her dessert. Absolutely extraordinary. The full contingent consists of 178 pieces. She also loved porcelain. This is a dessert service made by Chelsea, a very finely ornamented one, with some very nice seau à glace for serving ice cream. But everything changed in the 19th century when this man became the Duke. He had a building tunnels. He built a 7-mile tunnel from the house to the nearest railway station, which his horse and carriages would drive down. And these are some of the tunnels that he had. He also to this complex of kitchens, which is not just one kitchen, it's many, many rooms. Above, their bedrooms were up above the kitchen. But I want to show you this. This is a close-up of the kitchen, and it's got room. You can see it bigger here. Is that better? Hear me all right? Yeah. So first electric you can see. Do it with this, okay. Is that better? Can you hear me? Yeah. So this is the first electrical kitchen in Britain. These are the ovens, and you can see the cables. Unfortunately, it was ironically destroyed by fire. Yeah. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Right. It was destroyed by fire in 1900, so this is just before then. But what's interesting is, this is a hot plate. The dishes had covers on them, and then they went down a hoist, a lift, to the basement. The cook and the servants could come down some stairs. So Here's another photograph of it. So this is the lift that takes the food hot down below, and it was loaded onto this thing, which is called the dinner wagon, and it had a base made of zinc, and you could put hot charcoal in the bottom, and then the servants pushed it along the railway line, which, this is a wonderful drawing made in 1881 of it there, the kitchen wagon or truck. And eventually it arrived below the dining room and came up in a lift to this room. And there's the dining room. I'll just go back. This dining room was destroyed in 1901 by a fire, which is ironic, but it didn't start in the kitchen. So this was taken before the fire. So they repaired this room, which was only partially damaged by the fire, and set this up as the new dining room. And this is a photograph from about 1906, in that wonderful Gothic perpendicular room set for dinner. It's a very rare photograph. I just recently discovered it. And what started the fire was this. It's an electrical iron, and one of the servants was ironing the ribbons of the 8-year-old daughter of the Duke and Duchess. She was going to a party, and they had their own power station, which employed 5 people on the property. So they worked the electrical, but the electricity was very difficult, and it failed. She was ironing, and then suddenly everything, the lights went off, and it stopped. So she just left the iron on the table and went to bed. And in the night, it switched on again, and of course it caught fire to the ribbons, which burned half the house down. So it didn't matter about the kitchen being like, 150 meters away from it was another thing that caused the fire. So this is the Duke and Duchess, who were the parents of this Princess Lady Victoria. And she was a beautiful, wonderful woman, Winifred. And I discovered recently something quite extraordinary in the house. In England, when somebody got married, the family would pay for the workers to have an ox roasted. So this is a whole bullock, an ox, roasted on a spit in front of a fire, usually by butchers. And if you look very carefully, you can see that this man here has got a huge knife and a fork. And this was common as well. These would be made to commemorate the event. So I discovered them in a room in the kitchen complex. There they are. And it's got the date of the wedding of the couple on them, okay? I'm going to finish there, and of course I'm happy to answer any questions later on. But these large properties, they are very difficult in terms of moving food from one place to the other. The Welbeck house, this one here, solved the issue, as did the first one I showed you, with a railway line. But they didn't have a locomotive. The servants still had to push the food along to the dining room. And the idea was to keep it hot. It really had to be hot. So I'll end here with a little story about one of the more recent dukes who died in 1973. He was the last duke. He had 2 daughters. And they were still using, in the 1930s, the railway line with the truck. And what the 2 daughters did was they went down there and they changed the points. There was a branch line that took coal to a cellar. So the Duke's dinner ended up going, instead of going to the dining room, went into the coal cellar. And he sat there in the dining room waiting for his dinner, which never arrived, in fact. So anyway, I'll end there, and we can, have questions later on. So thank you very much for listening.